Dee was one of the most caring and giving people you could ever imagine.
She was a good person. She was outgoing. She was spunky, to say the least.
She loved to be together.
She was a strong woman.
She protected everyone.
As far as the children, she couldn't be any better. And then when grandchildren came along, I mean, she just lit up like a star.
She was adamant that she is Nana and not a grandma.
I mean, this woman would step in front of a bullet for them in a heartbeat.
It was certainly tough for the family to face my sister's remains in a man-made tomb.
She didn't deserve this.
Lenawee County woman who's been missing since 2021.
The mother of 5 from Lenawee County has been missing for 2.5 years now, and her brother believes that the man behind bars is someone he suspected all along.
Okay. We got a warrant for your arrest, buddy. Put your hands behind your back. Are you serious?
Dale and Dee Warner didn't start as strangers falling in love. By the time they married in 2006, they were already two people who understood leverage, what it meant to build something and what it meant to protect it. Each came into the marriage with 4 kids from previous relationships. Together, they'd go on to have one more, a daughter named Angelina. On paper, it looked like a modern blended family making it work in rural Lenawee County, Michigan. 2 farms, 2 histories, 1 name over the door. But the real foundation of the Warner household wasn't the marriage, it was the money. Dee wasn't a farmer's wife who stayed home and kept books on the side. She was the architect. She built DDW Investments from almost nothing into a working operation with 3 moving parts: a trucking company hauling freight across state lines, a farming business raising crops on the family's land, and a chemical division supplying fertilizer and seed to other operations in the county. By the time the business matured, it employed around 15 people and generated real revenue, the kind of revenue that turns a rural property into something worth fighting over. People in the community knew Dee as the driving force. She was the one closing deals, managing payroll, keeping 3 separate businesses from collapsing into each other. Dale worked alongside her, but multiple people who knew the couple would later describe the marriage the same way. It functioned less like a romance and more like a partnership, and increasingly an unequal one. That distinction matters because it's the detail that turns this from a missing persons case into something colder. When a marriage is built on love, betrayal looks like an affair, a fight, a slammed door. When a marriage is built on a business empire, betrayal looks like something else entirely. A signature on the wrong form, a name quietly added to an account, an asset moved somewhere it shouldn't be. And Dee Warner was, by every account, the primary owner. 50% of the land, 50% of the businesses, a stake that couldn't just be walked away from, not by her, and as it would turn out, not by Dale either. For 15 years, that partnership held. The trucks ran, the crops came in, the chemical tanks sat where they'd always sat, doing exactly what they were built to do. One of them wouldn't stay that way for long. By 2020, the marriage that had built an empire was starting to crack, and the cracks weren't about love. They were about control, suspicion, and who would walk away with what was left. That's where this story really begins. By 2020, Dale Warner wasn't just running businesses alongside his wife. According to court testimony, he was watching her. Investigators would later document a data analyst's findings from General Motors. Between January 2020 and April 2021, Dale checked the location of Dee's Cadillac Escalade more than 2,100 times. That's not a jealous glance at a phone. That's a pattern, roughly 4 to 5 checks a day, every day, for over a year. The Escalade wasn't the only vehicle being watched. Court testimony established that Dale also had an employee purchase a GPS tracker and install it on Dee's Hummer. According to Dee's daughter, Raquel, her mother had actually found the device herself and showed it to her, proof that Dee knew, at least in part, that she was being tracked. Then there was the phone. Testimony indicated Dale asked another employee to clone the contents of Dee's phone, giving him access to her messages and communications without her knowledge. For a man supposedly focused on running 3 businesses, Dale was spending a remarkable amount of time monitoring the movements and conversations of the woman who owned half of them. This is where the fatal triangle element of the case enters, carefully and through the record, not speculation. Madison Wolfe, who worked for the Warners as Dee's nanny and personal assistant, later testified that Dee had, at one point, had an affair. The court record doesn't frame this as the motive for what happened, but it does help explain the deteriorating trust inside a marriage that was already more business partnership than romance. Whether Dale's surveillance predated his suspicions or fueled them, the effect was the same. A marriage running on control instead of communication. And the control wasn't only digital. Dee's business manager, Stephanie Volkley, testified that sometime around late 2020, Dee showed her an injury, a raised bump on her forehead, roughly the size of a quarter, partially hidden under her hair. Volkley also testified that Dee seemed visibly uncomfortable when Dale attempted to massage her neck and shoulders, particularly after an argument. On its own, that detail might mean nothing. In hindsight, given what Dale would later claim happened on the night Dee disappeared, it means quite a bit. By December 2020, 4 months before she vanished, Dee had already tried once to leave. She told a friend that when she raised the subject of separating, Dale threatened to keep their daughter Angelina from her. She used a specific phrase to describe what she felt in that moment, that she genuinely believed he could kill her. At the time, no one outside her small circle heard that warning. It would resurface later in court as one of the most chilling pieces of testimony in the entire case. None of this, on its own, proved murder. Surveillance isn't a crime. Suspicion of infidelity isn't a crime. But together, they built a picture prosecutors would eventually put in front of a jury. A marriage where money, control, and mistrust had replaced whatever partnership once existed. And in April 2021, all 3 of those pressures were about to collide at once. April 24, 2021 was a Saturday. And by the end of it, Dee Warner had told at least 4 different people the same thing. She was done with her marriage. She started the day with a hair and lash appointment, a small, ordinary errand that turned out to matter later because it put a timestamp on her emotional state. Her aestheticist noticed she'd been crying and asked what was wrong. Dee told her she and Dale had been fighting. She still booked a follow-up appointment for the next week, a detail prosecutors would later point to as evidence she had no plans to disappear. Throughout the day, Dee visited 2 of her adult children. She told her son Zach in a text message that she was done and planned to sign over her share of the family businesses to him. She confided in her daughter Raquel, something that would later be repeated in court, that she was afraid of what Dale might do if she left him. That evening, the tension in the Warner household reached its peak. According to testimony, Dee got into a 3-way argument with Dale and Todd Nink, an employee who managed the trucking side of the business. The fight was about money and control. Dee believed Nink was undermining her authority in the company, and she felt Dale was consistently taking his side over hers. At 10:34 p.m., Dee made one decision that stands out in hindsight. She arranged for her youngest daughter, Angelina, to spend the night at a friend's house. Whether that was precaution or coincidence, investigators would later view it as significant. Dee made sure her 9-year-old wasn't in the house for whatever was coming next. Dale would later tell police that the argument that night was the worst of their marriage, centered, in his words, on money and infidelity. He claimed that by the end of the night, things had calmed down. According to his account, Dee fell asleep on the living room floor while he massaged her neck, and he carried her to the couch before going to bed himself. That story would later become one of several details investigators struggled to reconcile with the physical evidence. At 10:24 p.m., a friend sent Dee a text asking how her night was going. Anyone who knew Dee knew she was a fast texter, expressive, constant, rarely silent for more than a few minutes. This time, there was nothing for almost half an hour. Then, at 10:53 p.m., a reply came through. One letter, K. It was so out of character that when investigators later reconstructed Dee's phone activity, that single response stood out as one of the most important pieces of digital evidence in the entire case. Shortly after, her phone dropped from Wi-Fi to cellular service, and by 2:30 the following morning, it went dark completely. No calls, no messages, no app activity, nothing. Whatever happened inside that house between 10:24 p.m. and 2:30 a.m. would take Michigan State Police more than 3 years, a forensic financial trail, and a fertilizer tank on a farm 4 miles away to fully piece together. But at the time, no one knew any of that yet. All anyone knew as Sunday morning arrived was that Dee Warner wasn't answering her phone, and she never missed a Sunday. Quick pause before we go further. Somewhere in the next few minutes of this video is the exact moment Dale Warner stopped being a controlling husband and became a killer. Maybe it's a sentence. Maybe it's a single decision most people would scroll right past. Drop the timestamp in the comments where you think that line was crossed. We'll pin the most upvoted theory before this video's done. All right, let's keep going. Sunday, April 25th started like it had for years. Dee's daughter, Raquel, arrived at the family property around 9 a.m. with her boyfriend and young daughter for their standing weekly breakfast. It was routine. 3 generations, 1 table, every single week. This time, no one answered the door. That alone was strange. Dee never missed these breakfasts, and she never failed to answer when her daughter showed up. When Raquel finally found Dale on the property, what he handed her made things stranger still. Dee's wedding ring, a ring worth roughly $50,000, one she wore every day, without exception. Dale said he'd found it sitting on his desk in the office. Raquel didn't buy it. Her mother wasn't the kind of person to leave that ring behind, especially not if she was simply going somewhere for a few days, which is exactly what Dale was suggesting. He told family members Dee had taken a travel bag, her purse, her phone, her curling iron, and hairspray, the packing list of someone leaving on her own terms. But there was an immediate problem with that story. Both of Dee's vehicles were still on the property, one in the garage at home, the other parked at her office roughly 100 feet away. If she'd left voluntarily, she'd left without a car, without a ring, and without saying a word to anyone. Later, talking to a Lenawee County Sheriff's deputy on body camera footage, Dale added another detail that stood out to investigators. He claimed Dee had a second phone, a secret one he wasn't supposed to know about. It was an odd thing to volunteer about a woman who supposedly just needed a few days away, and it raised an obvious question. If it was secret, how exactly did Dale know about it? When Dee's son Zach arrived that same day to search the property, surveillance footage captured him checking the office where his mother kept her desk. At one point, Dale asked him directly, "You really don't know where your mom is?" A question that read to investigators later less like concern and more like probing. None of these details taken individually proved anything. People say strange things during a crisis. Stories get tangled under stress. But taken together, the ring that shouldn't have been left behind, the vehicles that hadn't moved, the secret phone no one else had ever heard of, they formed the first thread investigators would spend years pulling on. By the time Michigan State Police eventually took over the case from the Lenawee County Sheriff's Office, that thread had grown into something much larger. But in the earliest hours of April 25th, all anyone had were inconsistencies, a missing woman, and a husband whose explanations didn't quite hold together. While Dee's family searched for answers, private investigator Billy Little began digging into something else entirely: the paperwork. Little was brought in by Dee's family in March 2022, and what he found didn't just raise questions about Dale's story. It exposed a financial motive investigators couldn't ignore. At the center of it was a power of attorney dated back to 2014. Using that document, Dale transferred nearly all of the assets belonging to DDW Investments, the company Dee had built and owned 50% of, into a brand new entity called DDW Transportation. Little pointed out the obvious legal problem with this. When two names are on a title, one person can't simply move assets without the other's consent. Yet somehow, within months of Dee's disappearance, Dale had done exactly that. The timing wasn't subtle. By August 2021, just 4 months after Dee vanished, the transfer was already complete. Little's read on it was straightforward. Dale was securing control of the business before anyone started asking hard questions about where Dee actually was. The next move came in 2022 when Dale sold DDW Transportation to Lidwall Carriers Bulk. The sale generated real money. None of it went to Dee's estate. All of it went to Dale. Then there was Todd Nank, the same employee involved in the heated argument with Dee and Dale on the night Dee disappeared. Little's investigation turned up something odd. At 3:30 in the morning on April 25th, just hours after Dee vanished, Nank logged into the company's system under a false name and removed a shipment of lime from the farm, driving it out of state before continuing on to pick up a separate load in Chicago. It was unusual activity for that hour, under a name that wasn't his own. When Dale eventually sold the trucking business, Nank was hired almost immediately by the company that bought it, this time in a finance role. Little didn't frame that as a coincidence. He framed it as a reward. There was also the safe. Dee's son, Zach, testified that before his mother disappeared, he'd tried to access an electronic safe in the Warner home using the combination he'd always used, and it no longer worked. When he located a spare key, he opened the safe and found that a significant amount of cash Dee had stored there was gone. Only Zach and Dee had ever known that combination or had access to that key. None of this was about a single dramatic reveal. It was about a pattern. Assets moved, money missing, a business quietly changing hands while the woman who legally owned half of it was gone without a trace. For investigators, it answered the question true crime always circles back to. Not just who had the opportunity, but who stood to gain. And in this case, the paper trail pointed in exactly one direction. By the summer of 2022, the Lenawee County Sheriff's Office had spent over a year on Dee Warner's disappearance without a breakthrough. In August of that year, the case was formally handed to the Michigan State Police, a signal that local investigators had taken the case as far as they could, and that what remained needed a bigger toolkit. Leading the new phase of the investigation was Detective Daniel Dreyer. Rather than starting from scratch, MSP began reassembling everything that had already been gathered. Surveillance footage from the Warner property, financial records tied to the asset transfers, cell phone data, and hours of inconsistent statements Dale had given to family members, deputies, and eventually detectives. What made this case difficult wasn't a lack of evidence, it was the type of evidence. There was no body, no crime scene in the traditional sense, no murder weapon. What investigators had instead was something prosecutors would later have to build an entire case around: circumstantial evidence, layered and cross-referenced until it formed a single coherent picture. That picture included the GPS tracking, the phone cloning, and the pattern of control established well before Dee vanished. It included the financial motive Billy Little's investigation had uncovered: assets moved, a business transferred, money missing from a safe only 2 people had access to. It included surveillance footage placing Dale in specific locations at specific times, footage that didn't match the version of events he'd given police. And it included the accumulated weight of a story that had shifted more than once. The wedding ring explanation, the secret phone claim, the version where Dee simply packed a bag and left, despite both her vehicles remaining exactly where they always were. On November 21, 2023, Michigan State Police made their move. Dale Warner, then 53, was arrested at his home without incident and charged with open murder and tampering with evidence. It's worth pausing on that charge because it's unusual. Prosecutors filed a murder charge against Dale before Dee's body had even been found. That's a significant legal decision. It meant investigators and prosecutors were confident enough in the circumstantial case they'd built that they didn't need to wait for physical remains to move forward. At his arraignment the next day, Dale pleaded not guilty. Prosecutors requested a $20 million bond, arguing he posed a flight risk. The judge agreed, ordering him held without bond. For Dee's family, the arrest was validation of what they'd believed for over 2.5 years. But it also came with a harder truth to accept. An arrest didn't mean Dee was coming home. It meant the case had reached a point where investigators were certain enough to say out loud that she wasn't. What no one knew yet was exactly where she'd been the entire time and how close investigators had already come, without realizing it, to finding her. The break that finally located Dee Warner didn't come from a confession. It came from a piece of surveillance footage investigators had already had for a while. They just hadn't known what they were looking at yet. The footage showed Dale, back in 2021, using a front-end loader to move an anhydrous ammonia tank into a spray barn on the property. Separately, drone footage captured by law enforcement during an earlier search showed the same tank being relocated again. On its own, farm equipment being moved around a working farm means nothing, but investigators eventually connected the timing of that movement to a specific detail. Dale's son, Jaron, had called him to warn that cadaver dogs would be searching the property. Shortly after that call, the tank moved. That connection was enough to bring investigators back to a location they'd already searched once before, this time with a much narrower focus. On August 16, 2024, Michigan State Police executed a search warrant on Dale's property on Paragon Road in Tipton, about 4 miles from the home Dee and Dale had shared. Inside a barn, they located the tank, sealed on both ends, repainted, and no longer holding any ammonia at all. When investigators opened it, they found human remains. 6 days later, on August 22nd, the Jackson County Medical Examiner's Office confirmed through dental records what Dee's family had feared for more than 3 years. The remains were hers. Dr. Patrick Cho, the medical examiner who conducted the autopsy, ruled Dee's death a homicide. He determined the cause of death to be strangulation combined with blunt force trauma to the head and face. For Dee's family, the discovery closed one question and opened another. They finally knew what had happened to her. What remained was proving, in a courtroom, exactly how it had happened and holding the person responsible accountable for a crime he'd spent over 3 years trying to make sure no one ever found. Michigan State Police now had a body, a cause of death, and a timeline that stretched back to April 2021. What they still needed was a jury willing to connect every piece of that timeline into a single, undeniable conclusion. That process would take another 1.5 years to complete. Before we head into the courtroom, if you want to see exactly how a 5-year cold case gets proven beyond a reasonable doubt to 12 strangers, stick around. It's coming up next. But first, hit subscribe. Next week, we're covering a case the true crime world hasn't touched yet, and you'll want to be here for it. The trial began on February 12, 2026, in the 39th Circuit Court in Adrian, Michigan, nearly 5 years after Dee Warner was first reported missing and roughly 18 months after her remains were found. It would stretch across 13 days of testimony from 35 witnesses, making it one of the more extensive circumstantial murder cases the county had seen. Leading the prosecution was Jacqueline Wise. On the other side of the courtroom was Mary Chartier, who had represented Dale since before his 2023 arrest. Her strategy from the outset was consistent: argue that the prosecution's entire case rested on theory and speculation, not direct proof. The prosecution's approach was to build the case in layers, establishing motive first, then opportunity, then consciousness of guilt. Early testimony focused on the marriage itself. Witnesses described a partnership that had grown increasingly strained over money and control. Among them was Madison Wolfe, who had worked as Dee's nanny and personal assistant. Wolfe testified that Dee had, at one point, had an affair, testimony that gave the jury a fuller picture of a relationship already fraying under financial pressure, without the case ever hinging on that detail as a standalone motive. Then came the data. A cell phone records analyst with Michigan State Police and a vehicle data investigator from General Motors walked the jury through the digital trail Dale had left behind, including the more than 2,100 location checks he'd made on Dee's Cadillac Escalade between January 2020 and April 2021. For jurors, this wasn't circumstantial in the abstract sense. It was a number, repeated and documented, that painted a specific pattern of behavior in the months leading up to Dee's disappearance. Body camera footage from Dale's earliest interactions with police was also shown to the jury. The same footage that had first raised red flags for investigators years earlier. Jurors watched Dale offer theories about where his wife might have gone, calm and matter-of-fact, a tone several witnesses would later describe as inconsistent with a man whose wife had genuinely vanished. One of the more pointed pieces of evidence came from recorded jail calls introduced during testimony from the lead Michigan State Police investigator. Alongside that testimony came detail on a rift between the two agencies that had worked the case, Lenawee County Sheriff's Office and Michigan State Police, and specifically how investigators ultimately zeroed in on the idea of checking farm tanks for a body. The medical examiner, Dr. Patrick Cho, also testified, walking the jury through his ruling that Dee's death was a homicide caused by strangulation and blunt force trauma. Lead detective Daniel Dreyer testified as well, tying together years of investigative work into a single narrative for the jury to follow. By day 11, the prosecution rested. The defense's case, by contrast, was brief. Its most notable moment came from an unexpected witness, Greg Hardy, Dee's brother, who had spent years pushing both police agencies to keep investigating his sister's disappearance. His testimony was emotional, and it underscored something both sides seemed to agree on. Whatever else was in dispute, Dee Warner's family had never stopped looking for the truth. Dale Warner did not testify in his own defense. Closing arguments laid out the case in its simplest terms. Wise argued that a long, troubled marriage had turned dangerous once Dee made clear she intended to divorce Dale and sell their businesses, and that Dale, having spent years monitoring and controlling her, was unwilling to let that happen. Chartier maintained that no piece of evidence on its own proved her client had committed murder. The case went to the jury on a Thursday afternoon. Deliberations were paused the next morning after a juror had a medical emergency, delaying the process until the following Tuesday. By then, 5 years of investigation, a financial paper trail, and 13 days of testimony had all been placed in the hands of 12 people from Lenawee County. What they decided would determine whether Dee Warner's family finally got the answer they'd spent half a decade fighting for. The jury resumed deliberations Tuesday, March 10, 2026, after the delay caused by a juror's medical emergency. By late afternoon, they had reached a decision. At 5:20 p.m., the verdict was read: guilty on second-degree murder and guilty on tampering with evidence. That distinction matters. Dale had been charged with open murder, meaning the jury had the option to convict on first-degree premeditated murder. They didn't. Second-degree murder doesn't require proof of premeditation, only that the killing was intentional. For the prosecution, it was a win. For Dee's family, it came with a note of frustration that would surface later that day. Outside the courthouse, Greg Hardy addressed reporters. He said it had been a long time coming and admitted the verdict was almost hard to process after everything his family had fought through. He also didn't hide his disappointment that the jury hadn't gone further, calling Dale, in blunt terms, an atrocious excuse for a human being. But he was clear about one thing. After 5 years, this finally felt like a win for his sister. Sentencing was scheduled for May 7th at the Lenawee County Courthouse in front of Judge Michael Olsaver. The hearing drew Dee's family in full. 5 people gave victim impact statements, including Hardy, Dee's daughter Raquel Bach, and her son TJ Bach. TJ told the court that he hadn't wanted to believe his stepfather was capable of this, the same way he hadn't wanted to believe his mother would simply vanish without a word. Only one of those things, he said, turned out to be true. Raquel described how Dale had cut off contact between her and her younger half-sister, letting the child believe her own mother had simply started a new life somewhere else. Greg Hardy, told by the judge to direct his comments to the bench rather than the defendant, didn't hold back, calling Dale a narcissistic, remorseless liar who deserved the fullest punishment the law allowed. Dale's defense didn't dispute the conviction at this stage. Instead, his attorney described him as a kind, even-tempered man who had contributed to his community, an argument aimed less at guilt and more at the length of the sentence still to come. Judge Olsaver wasn't swayed. In his remarks, he noted that Dee had an average life expectancy of roughly 29 more years Dale had taken from her, on top of everything he'd taken from the people she left behind. He sentenced Dale to 31¼ to 60 years in prison for second-degree murder, followed by a consecutive sentence of 17 months to 10 years for tampering with evidence. Combined, the sentence adds up to as much as 70 years. Dale will be eligible for parole in 33 years, meaning at minimum he'll be in his early 90s before that's even a possibility. Dale's attorney confirmed he intends to appeal, arguing the trial should have been moved out of Lenawee County due to pre-trial publicity. For now, though, the case that took 5 years to solve has finally reached its legal conclusion. What comes next for Dee's family is something they've waited far longer than a courtroom timeline to feel: closure. By the time Dale Warner was sentenced, the case had already reached far beyond Lenawee County, one of the more closely watched cases in the country, not because of a single dramatic twist, but because of how methodically it came together over 5 years. For years, Greg Hardy ran a campaign called Justice for Dee, refusing to let his sister's case fade into the pile of unresolved missing persons files. After the sentencing, he said it finally felt less like a fight and more like a win. That campaign is closed now. What remains is the record, a jury's verdict, a judge's sentence, and a family that spent 5 years insisting on the truth until the truth caught up. What makes this case worth remembering isn't just the tank or the tracking devices or the single letter K. It's the pattern underneath all of it. A relationship where control quietly replaced trust, where money became more valuable than the person who earned it, and where every attempt to erase a paper trail ended up creating one instead. That pattern shows up more often than people think, and it's exactly the kind of case we'll keep coming back to here, not for the shock value, but for what the evidence, patiently followed, eventually reveals. If you want the follow-through other true crime content skips, from arrest to verdict to sentencing, subscribe now. The next case we're tracking is still unfolding, and you'll want to be here when it breaks.